Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, clearly I stand in support of the resolution tabled by the Minister for Finance, the Honourable Member for Kasvis East, to approve the draft value-added tax amendment of Schedule 3, order which seeks to amend Schedule 3 of the value-added tax by A, deleting in paragraph 19B the Tourism Incentives Act, Cap 1530, specified under subparagraph 3, and B, including the exemption of value-added tax granted under 1 Tourism Development Act number 1 of 2024, commencing from the 15th day of April 2024, and 2, Tourism Stimulus and Investment Act, Cap 3.18, commencing from the 13th day of May 2014 and terminating on the 15th day of April 2024, unless saved under Section 156 of the Tourism Development Act, number 1 of 2024. Mr. Speaker, I give my support to the resolution on the basis that we live in a very different world to the one we once knew. During the Cold War, foreign aid flowed here almost like milk and honey. But the post-Cold War dividends have not materialized for the vast majority of humanity. And so we were confronted with a decline in official development assistance, erosion of trade preferences, and of course the climate crisis that continues is decimating much across the environmental, social, and economic fabric of small island developing states. And to make matters worse, Mr. Speaker, great power rivalry is fueling major turbulence and death in the contemporary global political environment. So small states like ours have found ourselves living in a very different international context. We exist in a very different world. We are confronted with economic volatility, high indebtedness. The World Bank and other international financial institutions suggest to us that we should move into financial services, and at every turn they had roadblocks, including blacklisting. We have now turned to tourism as an engine for economic growth, and despite its inherent vulnerabilities, Mr. Speaker, we need to continue to grapple with the objective reality of tourism being our primary driver of economic growth. And so, Mr. Speaker, as small island developing states, we are being urged to reduce and even eliminate tax concessions as a tool to stimulate our sectors. According to these multilateral institutions, this strategy for economic development, which according to them, in essence, is like government trying to actively promote certain sectors, or, as they like to say, picking winners, has failed. In fact, Mr. Speaker, they have even gone as far as to say that these concessions, which they have labeled as tax expenditures, are not necessary and only contribute to worsening the fiscal deficit. We have, however, Mr. Speaker, more recently seen a major shift in the economic strategy in the developed world, in which protectionism has become the order of the day. It is now called industrial policy, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that globalization has been discredited now, and that all countries are implementing policies in their best national or sovereign interest. Notwithstanding what I have said, Mr. Speaker, we do know that the East Asian tigers, namely South Korea, Hong Kong, which is now part of China, Singapore and Taiwan, grew because of the support government gave to industrial development through concessions. There is therefore tangible evidence, Mr. Speaker, that fiscal concessions have an important part to play in the development of our economy once they are targeted appropriately, efficiently and effectively. Mr. Speaker, it is to be noted that all countries provide fiscal concessions which include removal of import duties on construction materials to promote investment in strategic industries. We are all aware that the tourism sector is the largest economic sector in terms of value added, employment, and foreign exchange earnings. It is the primary sector driving economic growth and development in St. Lucia. It is to be noted again that while tourism is not measured as a sector in gross domestic product, the food and accommodation sector is used as a proxy, but still significantly underestimates the tourism sector's contribution to GDP. A review of the GDP, Mr. Speaker, at constant prices over the period 2006 to 2022 shows the growing importance of tourism as measured by the food and accommodation sector, which I have previously stated grossly underestimates tourism's contribution to GDP. On average, the food and accommodation sector's share of GDP ranged from a low of 17.2% in 2008 to a peak of 20.9% in 2019. I have deliberately excluded 2020 because of the impact of COVID, when we all witnessed that the world lost its appetite for trade and investment. In that year, the food and accommodation sector accounted for a mere 9.2% of GDP. I repeat, it accounted in 2020 for a mere 9.2% of GDP. We saw the massive impact that the sector had on GDP growth in 2020, resulting in a contraction of GDP of 25.4%. In that same year, Mr. Speaker, the food and accommodation sector contracted by a remarkable 67%. There is still significant potential for growth in the tourism sector, and Mr. Speaker, we understand that we are competing with other states for tourism investment. We therefore need to provide fiscal concessions to ensure that we can remain competitive in spurring new investments in the tourism sector and thus enhance the growth of our economy with the resulting spin-off benefits in the form of employment, growth in other sectors dependent on tourism, and foreign exchange earnings, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the resolution tabled by the Minister for Finance is a simple one, as it seeks to continue the concessions that were given under the Tourism Incentives Act 15.30, which has since been revoked given the passage of the Tourism Development Act number 1 of 2024. We must also accentuate in this Honorable House, Mr. Speaker, that the Tourism Development Act, which not only consolidated the previous 3 pieces of legislation, namely the Tourism Incentives Act, Cap 15.30, the Tourism Stimulus and Investment Act, Cap 15.03, and the Tourism Levy Act, Cap 15.36, which have all been repealed, but also catered for an inclusive, resilient, and sustainable tourism sector. The Tourism Development Act, Mr. Speaker, provides a number of incentives which are stated in Schedule 3 of the Act and covers the following areas: 1, tourism accommodation; 2, food and beverage; 3, tourism transportation; 4, recreation; 5, meetings, incentives, conferences, and other planners; 6, tourism facilitation services and travel trade; 7, tourism niche market; 8, specialized support areas. And of course, Mr. Speaker, the picture is evolving as a holistic approach to building a tourism sector that will be able to withstand the turbulence of the current moment. As more countries around the world embrace tourism as an engine for economic growth, the terrain is becoming more competitive. As I prepare to close, Mr. Speaker, a review of Schedule 3, Part A, which shows the incentives to be provided for tourism investment, shows that VAT is exempted on building materials, equipment, furniture, fixtures, and fittings. In addition, Schedule 3, Part D, Mr. Speaker, incentives are granted for resilience under this section VAT is exempted for services, Mr. Speaker. Based on the foregoing, it is clear that our government has broadened the concessions offered to investors in the tourism sector, small, medium, and large investors, in recognition of ensuring that we encourage developments in all areas of the tourism sector. Mr. Speaker, I would like to add that our government has been responsible for the expansion in the tourism sector, adding to the number of rooms in the hotel industry. The previous government did not add one hotel room during the period 2016 to 2021. Sometimes I hear those who chastise this government about they should have built a hotel in Canry's Ancillary. There are those who spent 2 entire terms as Minister for Tourism, didn't build a cage in that area. And Mr. Speaker, if anyone who points their finger at the government and talk about hotel rooms, I want them to show us the hotel they built in the constituency of Ancillary Canries, and we are going to double the number of rooms that you all have on that hotel. By tomorrow, we are going to double it instantly. It is also clear, Mr. Speaker, that under the current tenure of our government, there are a number of hotel investments that are currently being implemented or will commence construction shortly. It is to be noted that Section 113 of the Value Added Tax states as follows. Exemption in another law. A provision is another law that grants an exemption under Section 17 or 21 of this Act, or a tax at a rate of 0% under Section 16 of this Act does not come into effect for the purposes of this Act until a corresponding amendment is made to this Act. There is therefore a need, a pressing need, Mr. Speaker, to make an amendment to the value-added tax to give effect to the VAT concessions granted under the Tourism Development Act. There is also the need to preserve the VAT concessions granted under the Tourism Incentives Act, cap 3.18, commencing from the 14th day of May 2014 and terminating on the 15th day of April 2024, unless saved under Section 156 of the Tourism Development Act, number 1 of 2024. So I close, Mr. Speaker, by accentuating my firm support to the resolution to amend the VAT Act by deleting in paragraph 19B the Tourism Incentives Act, cap 15.30, specified under subparagraph 3, as this Act has been repealed, and B, including the exemption of value-added tax granted under 1 Tourism Development Act, number 1 of 2024, commencing from the 15th day of April 2024, and Tourism Stimulus and Investment Act 3.18, commencing from the 14th day of May 2014 and terminating on the 15th day of April 2024, unless saved under Section 156 of the Tourism Development Act, number 1 of 2024. Mr. Speaker, this is a progressive government implementing progressive policies to ensure that we build resilience in the economy and continue to develop all sectors. Long live the Prime Minister, long live the member for Castres East, and long live this government to continue the development of our country. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.